So welcome back to Know Thy Addendum. Now we're going to discuss the subject to sale of buyer's property addendum. But before we get there, so let's just set up the scenario. You have a client, right, that wants to sell a house and then buy another one. Okay. So, and if they have to sell this house to qualify for the next one, and even if they just want to, in other words, they don't want to buy the next one unless they could sell this one. So for whatever reason, if they have to or if they, want to. Okay. So with that scenario, so let's identify the parties. Okay. Because you're gonna hear different people because your client is a seller and they are a buyer. And then if they have a property that they're selling, well, then they would have a buyer, and then the property that they're purchasing, there would be a seller. So your client is both, but there's multiples in there. So it's important that we keep the correct labels so that when we're talking, we know which seller we're talking about, we know which buyer we're talking about. So there's buyer, there's seller buyer, which is your client, and then there's seller, which is the seller that we're purchasing from. Got it? So let's move on to the next slide. So this is section 2.2 of the REPSI. So you have a seller buyer, a client that wants to sell and purchase, and then however, they're making an offer. So your seller buyer is making an offer to a seller, but that offer is subject to the sale, right? So it says right here, buyer's ability to purchase the property, comma, to obtain the loan referenced in section 2.1c above. Remember, this is the REPSI, or any portion of the cash referenced in section 2.1e above is or is not conditioned upon the sale. So if it is, in this case it is, so we would check is, and then if checked in the affirmative, the terms of the attached subject to sale buyer's property addendum apply. Okay, so because we have to sell this property, our seller buyer, so we're going to move on. Let's move on to the next slide because now we're going to go to the addendum. Okay, so the subject to sale condition, buyer's obligation, right? So this is really your seller buyer because this is an addendum to the offer that your seller buyer is making to a seller, right? But in this addendum, because there's two contracts that are going to happen, okay, but we're separating the two. So in this, they don't call them seller buyer because they're only referring as one contract. So the buyer, which again is our seller buyer, obligation to purchase the property is conditioned upon the closing of the sale of the buyer's property located at, and you put the address, buyer's property, by 5 p.m. Mountain Time on blank day of blank month and year, the buyer's closing deadline. Let's stop there for a second. It references buyer's closing deadline. Now the REPSI, okay, the REPSI references the settlement deadline, okay? So now the seller buyer, when they're making an offer, right, they're going to make an offer that's going to have a settlement deadline, but then it's going to have this closing deadline in here. But this closing deadline is referencing the sale of the seller's buyer's property to a buyer. Okay, that's the closing deadline we're talking about here. Okay, but it's clear to know that you have settlement deadline, and to understand the difference, go back to section 3 of the REPSI, which goes through settlement, closing, possession. Right, those are the three sections of section 3. So keep that in mind. That's important because settlement, you could settle today, but not fund and record, which is closing for 4 days. So you have to be careful and understand those deadlines. And we'll talk more about that. So if the closing of the sale of buyer's property, which again is our seller buyer, does not occur by the buyer's closing deadline, buyer may, within 4 days after the buyer's closing deadline, cancel the REPSI by providing written notice to seller. In event of such cancellation, the earnest money deposits released back to the buyer. This is referred to as subject to sale condition. Okay, so the first clause of that document of the subject to sale of buyer's property addendum is we're just identifying, hey, this contract is conditioned upon us closing on a property. Okay, so now let's dive deeper into it. Okay, so section 2, buyer's disclosure. Buyer's property is or is not currently listed for sale through a real estate brokerage. If listed, the name of the seller's agent and seller's brokerage are as follows. Now, if is my contention that if you have a listing contract signed and it is not in the MLS, and if it's not in the MLS, you have to have what's called the MLS exclusion form signed and turned into the MLS. Okay, which means you have a contract because the MLS rule says you must publish the listing within so many days, five days. So so if you have the document, if you have a listing contract signed, then you're not going to be in the MLS in the first 5 days because let's suppose your seller buyer doesn't want to publish their listing until they have until they found a property that they want to purchase. So if that's the case, you have to have the MLS exclusion signed and turned into the MLS. So it is my contention that if you have the contract signed, the MLS exclusion, then yes, you are currently listed for sale, although you're not published in the MLS. So, I mean, that could be argued either way, but again, I'm sticking to the point that you are listed, okay? Because it's a listing contract, boom. So that's how I feel about that. Anyway, let's move on to the next slide. So 3, additional terms. Check applicable box, and then note it says, if neither box is checked below, then this section 3 shall not apply, okay? So A, buyer's property is currently under contract with a purchaser, and they call that a third-party contract. So your seller buyer, so this is saying if A is checked, then it means your seller buyer has a contract to sell the property with a buyer. So a buyer, right? So you have the buyer purchasing a contract from your seller buyer. And then the settlement deadline is of the third-party contract is blank and blank and blank, right? That settlement deadline cannot be extended without prior written consent of the seller. So if you have a contract and for whatever reason you just need to extend the deadline, you need the seller, and we're talking about the deadline of the property that you're selling, the seller buyer selling to a buyer, right? So if that deadline changes, you need permission from the seller to move because they entered into a contract with the idea that it's going to settle on a certain date. If it changes, you need to talk to them. Okay. If third-party contract is canceled, buyer shall provide seller with written notice of no later than 4 days after such cancellation. In such event, buyer or seller may cancel the REPSI. So just because it's canceled doesn't mean the contract is over, but the seller can cancel. In other words, if you don't have a contract, you can say, hey, you can cancel, or that we can change the condition. So, but if you're running the situation, call me. We'll work through it. So if it is canceled, whatever by either party, the earnest money is returned back to the buyer without the requirements for a further written authorization from seller. Okay. So next slide. So this is section B of 3. So the section 3 has 2 sections, A, and then that's broken into subsections. Then the second section is B. Buyer's property is not currently under contract with a purchaser. So when this says buyers, again, this is your seller buyer, your client, seller buyer. In other words, they do not have their property under contract with a buyer. So buyer, again, seller buyer, shall have until blank day to enter into a third-party contract. So let's stop and think about that. There's two major deadlines in here. And there's 3 if you count the settlement deadlines. But if the first clause, right, section 1 was your seller buyer has until blank date to close on the property that they're selling, and then. So section A said they have a buyer, but section B said that it is not under contract. So now they have until blank date to enter into a third-party contract. So in other words, they got to get the property that they're selling under contract with a third-party, with a buyer, which is called the third-party contract. If buyer has not entered into a third-party contract by that deadline, seller or buyer may cancel the REPSI by providing written notice to the other party. And then 4 days after the third-party contract deadline, whereupon the earnest money will return back to the buyer, okay, which is your seller buyer without blah, blah, blah. So if buyer enters into a third-party contract by third-party contract deadline, the settlement deadline in that contract shall be no later than 4 days prior to the settlement deadline contained in the REPSI and may not be extended without prior written consent of that. Okay, let's talk about that one. Let's slow that one down. We're going to rewind it and play it in slow motion. So if you enter into a third-party contract, right? So you're in the clause where you don't have it under contract. But now let's say you check and you have a third-party contract deadline. So let's say the whatever it is. And so if you now go out, you find a buyer, you enter into a third-party contract deadline to purchase your seller buyer's property, and you do it within your third-party contract deadline. So then your settlement deadline of that contract shall be no later than 4 days prior to the settlement deadline contained in the REPSI. So that means the property that your seller buyer is purchasing, right, which would be this contract, believe it or not. So it's confusing because you're talking about two different contracts, two separate REPSIs, right? And they both have a buyer and a seller. In this case, your client happens to be one of the parties in each. So let's say the property your seller buyer is buying is the settlement deadline is the 30th of this month, okay? Whatever month you're watching it. So the third party contract deadline can be no later than 4 days prior to. So let's say it's the 30th of this month, then the settlement deadline can't be any later than the 26th. So it has to settle on the 26th so that there's enough time for the 4 days of closing to close out and then close out on the next contract. Okay. So if third party contract is canceled, buyer, which is your seller buyer, agrees to provide seller with written notice no later than 4 days after such cancellation. In such event, the buyer or seller may cancel the contract, right? So cancel the REPSI. So if for whatever reason the contract fails, then the buyer and seller, you have to notify the seller, because remember the whole thing's conditioned upon this. So you have to notify the seller, and then either party at that point can cancel the REPSI. And if they do, then the earnest money is returned back to the buyer. Okay, this is a pretty complex situation. So if you find yourself listing a property this way, please call us. We are here to help you. We do not want you to put your client in a situation that they're damaged, they're stuck selling, or they're stuck buying, they can't get out of it, it didn't work, and they're in default, whatever. So I actually do a 2-hour core continuing education class on this scenario. I mean, it's more than just this. We do subject to, because you can list a property subject to your seller finding another property, so they have a contract with a buyer, but that contract's contingent upon your seller finding another property. And we'll cover that. But there's multiple scenarios in this. There's backups, there's time clauses, and we'll go deeper into each one of those. So again, please call us. If you've never done these, you have to call us. We're here to help you. Thanks. Have a great day.